We thought war was a math equation. Calculate the shielding, measure the plasma output, plot the casualty projections, and accept the inevitable surrender. We had conquered 20 star systems with arithmetic. Then we met them. They didn't calculate. They bled, they screamed, and they dug their boots into the mud like gravity itself belonged to them. I watched them hold a line that should have collapsed in minutes. That was the exact moment I knew our empire was already dead. The sky above the colony world of Harvest did not burn with the poetic fire of a dying star. It just turned a bruised, sickening purple, choked with the exhaust of 1,000 atmospheric entry vehicles. I was an observer for the coalition. My job was simple: record the pacification, catalog the resource capture, and log the tactical data for the archives. We were a logical species. We did not fight wars of passion. We fought wars of acquisition. Harvest was rich in heavy metals, and its current occupants, a newly encountered, physically unimpressive bipedal species calling themselves humanity, were mathematically obsolete. Our pre-invasion models gave them 4 standard cycles before total capitulation. They had crude projectile weapons. They used combustion engines. Their orbital defenses were little more than glorified debris fields retrofitted with mass drivers. It was, by all accounts, a routine pest removal. I stood on the command deck of the dreadnought Righteous Axiom, watching the thermal blooms of our orbital strikes. They were precise, clinical. We targeted their communication hubs, their power grids, their military installations. The casualty projections scrolled across my data pad in cool blue numerals. 2 million dead in the first hour, an acceptable margin to ensure immediate psychological collapse. They are silent. Commander Vane noted, his mandibles twitching in a gesture of mild satisfaction. Vane was a veteran of 6 pacifications. He viewed this assignment as a paid vacation. The central command structure is vaporized. Deploy the ground forces. Let us secure the extraction sites. We dropped into the dust. I rode in a command transport, hovering 20 meters above the shattered ruins of what their planetary maps called New Savannah. It wasn't a savanna anymore. It was a cratered wasteland of pulverized concrete and fused glass. The air scrubbers in my sealed suit whined, working overtime to filter out the heavy particulates of vaporized human architecture. Our infantry marched in perfect synchronized grids, shields locked, plasma rifles humming. The silence of the ruined city felt absolute. The math was working. Then the math broke. It started with a sound, not a siren, not a coordinated artillery barrage. It was a sharp, ugly crack that echoed off the broken masonry. One of our vanguard soldiers collapsed, his energy shield flickering and dying before a piece of propelled lead tore through his cranial plating. Vane frowned at the tactical display. A localized holdout, snipers. Burn the sector. Our plasma mortar turned the block into white-hot slag. Nothing could survive that temperature. Nothing biological. We moved forward. Another crack. Another soldier dropped. Then 10. Then 50. The fire wasn't coming from a fortified bunker. It was coming from the rubble, from the sewers, from underneath the corpses of their own dead. The humans hadn't surrendered when we destroyed their command structure. They had simply stopped waiting for orders. I watched through the magnification of my visor as a human emerged from a shattered basement. snorts. Greater than he was missing his left arm below the elbow. The stump was wrapped in a scorched piece of cloth. His uniform was unrecognizable, caked in gray ash and dried blood. He didn't have an energy shield. He didn't have heavy armor. He had a metal tube that fired explosive charges, and he was bracing it against the shattered frame of a doorway. He fired. The rocket streaked across the plaza, slamming into the side of our transport. The kinetic force bypassed our thermal shields completely. The world flipped. The sickening crunch of tearing metal filled my ears as the transport slammed into the earth. Sirens shrieked. My restraints dug into my flesh, snapping my clavicle. Vane was dead, impaled by a jagged piece of the control console. I tasted copper. My atmospheric seal was broken. The air of harvest rushed in smelling of ozone, burning plastic, and wet earth. I dragged myself from the wreckage, my sidearm trembling in my grip. I expected to find a coordinated military unit advancing on the crash site. I expected proper enemy protocol. Instead, I found him, the one-armed human. He was walking toward the burning transport, a smaller projectile weapon in his remaining hand. His snorts looked exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot, sinking deep into a face smeared with soot. He looked at Vane's corpse, then looked down at me. There was no battle cry, no grand speech. He just kicked my sidearm out of my hand with the toe of his heavy boot, aimed his weapon at my chest, and spat a wad of dark blood onto the fused glass beside my head. "Get up," he croaked. I didn't understand the language yet, but I understood the tone. It was the sound of something that refused to die, greater than snorts, greater than demanding that you acknowledge its existence. I stood, and for the first time in my life the observer became the captive. They dragged me into the earth, literally. The humans had abandoned the surface entirely. Beneath the ruins of New Savannah was a sprawling subterranean network of subway tunnels, maintenance shafts, and hastily excavated dirt trenches. It was dark, illuminated only by flickering low-wattage emergency lights strung up by fraying extension cords. The smell was the first thing that assaulted my senses. The Coalition lived in sterilized environments. Our ship smelled of recycled oxygen and citrus-scented chemical cleaners. This place smelled of unwashed bodies, gangrenous flesh, stale smoke, and fear. It was a suffocating, deeply organic stench. My captor, the one-armed man, shoved me into a wide chamber that used to be a transit hub. The tiled walls were cracked, plastered with faded advertisements for consumer goods that no longer existed. Now it was a triage center, and a command post rolled into one. "Look what I've found crawling out of a downed bird," the man grunted, pushing me forward. A larger human looked up from a folding table covered in crude paper maps. His name tag read Carter. He had a thick, unkempt beard and a deep scar cutting across his left cheek. He was smoking a small cylinder of dried leaves, blowing the carcinogenic vapor into the damp air. "A suit," Carter rasped. His voice sounded like grinding stones. "Doesn't look like they're trigger pullers." He was sitting in the back of the transport, looking at a data pad, the one-armed man said. Carter walked up to me. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly tired. He reached out and tapped the Coalition insignia on my chest plate. "You guys," Carter said, "are a real pain in the ass." They didn't torture me. They didn't even formally interrogate me. They just stripped me of my communications gear, bound my hands with coarse synthetic rope, and chained me to a rusted pipe in the corner of the room. I was a curiosity, a prize. For the next 3 solar cycles, I watched them. I watched a young female human, a medic named Finch. She couldn't have been more than 20 planetary years old. Her hands were permanently stained a dark, rusty brown. I watched her operate on a soldier whose legs had been cleanly severed by a plasma sweep. They had no anesthesia left. None. In our military, a soldier with that level of trauma would be instantly euthanized by an automated medical drone. It was a logical choice. Why expend resources on a unit that could no longer fight and was suffering immense pain? Finch didn't euthanize him. She clamped his arteries while he screamed. 4 other humans held him down. Carter knelt by his head, forcing a piece of hardened leather between the man's teeth so he wouldn't bite his own tongue off. Carter spoke to him the whole time. Not about the war, not about duty. Hold on, Jefferson. Just hold on. We're going to get you a mechanical rig. You're going to walk into O'Malley's pub, and you're going to make them buy you drinks for the rest of your miserable life. Focus on the beer, Jefferson. Focus on the beer. Jefferson lived. He shouldn't have. Biologically, the shock alone should have stopped his heart. But he lived. And 2 days later I saw him sitting up against a wall assembling explosive charges with shaking pale hands. It made no sense. I spoke to Carter on the 4th day. My translation implant had finally parsed enough of their localized syntax to allow for communication. "Why do you persist?" I asked him. My voice echoed slightly in the damp tunnel. Carter was cleaning a heavy kinetic rifle with a dirty rag. He paused, looking over at me. "You talk." "I am an observer. I process data. Your actions run contrary to all established survival metrics. Your military infrastructure is gone. Your planet is blockaded. We control the orbital space. Every mathematical probability dictates your extinction within the month. Surrender would guarantee a minimal casualty rate for your civilian population." Carter stared at me. Then he let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh. "Math," he said, shaking his head. He resumed cleaning the rifle. "You guys look at a spreadsheet and think you know how the universe works." "Numbers do not lie," I replied, stating a fundamental truth of the coalition. "Maybe," Carter muttered. He slammed the bolt of the rifle forward. The sharp metallic clack made me flinch. But numbers don't have a hometown. Flinch. But numbers don't have a hometown. Numbers didn't watch their kid sister get vaporized because some gray-skinned prick up in orbit pressed a button. "You want to know why we don't surrender?" He stood up, walking over to me. He leaned in close. I could smell the stale tobacco and the metallic tang of old blood on his breath. "Because we hate you," Carter whispered. "It's not about winning anymore. We know we're probably dead, but we are going to make you bleed for every single inch of dirt on this miserable rock. We're going to make taking this planet so expensive, so unbearably painful, that whoever sent you will choke on the bill." He walked away, leaving me chained to the pipe. I recorded the conversation in my internal memory banks. I categorized it under psychological anomaly. I still believed in the math. I still thought they were just a desperate, dying animal thrashing in the jaws of a predator. I didn't realize they were the predator. The coalition grew tired of the sniper fire and the improvised explosives. They decided to crack the earth open. The assault began at 0400 hours local time. It wasn't an infantry push. It was a localized orbital barrage using deep core seismic penetrators. The ceiling of the transit hub buckled. Dust poured down in the thick choking sheets. The lights flickered and died, completely plunging us into absolute darkness, save for the strobing red glare of a single emergency battery lamp. The ground heaved. I was thrown against the wall, the rusted pipe groaning under the strain of my chain. Humans scrambled in the dark. There was panic, yes, but it was organized. They were grabbing their kinetic weapons, their heavy repeaters, their crude blades. "They're breaching!" Someone screamed from down the tunnel. Sector 4, plasma cutters burning through the blast doors. Carter was immediately on his feet. He didn't issue a grand, inspiring command. He just racked his weapon and yelled, "If it glows, kill it." The blast door at the end of the main tunnel blew inward. The sheer heat of the explosion washed over the room, singeing the fine hairs on my face. Through the smoke, the coalition shock troops entered. They were beautiful in a terrifying mathematical way. Towering figures encased in polished white armor, their energy shields shimmering like liquid glass. They moved in perfect unison, firing concentrated bolts of superheated plasma that vaporized concrete and flesh with equal ease. The humans returned fire. The deafening roar of kinetic weapons in an enclosed space was physically painful. Bullets sparked and ricocheted off the coalition shields. For a moment the math held. The humans were outgunned. They were firing primitive lead at advanced energy fields. A plasma bolt caught a young private in the chest. He evaporated from the ribs down, his top half hitting the floor with a wet thud. Finch ran toward him, screaming his name, but there was nothing left to save. "Focus fire!" Carter roared over the din. "Hit the vanguard!" The humans concentrated their fire on a single coalition soldier. Hundreds of rounds slammed into his shield in seconds. The shield flared bright blue, whining under the kinetic stress, before finally shattering with a sound like breaking glass. The next dozen rounds tore through the white armor, dropping the soldier into the mud. It was a small victory, but it cost them dearly. The coalition troops advanced, laying down a suppressing fire that chewed the barricades to dust. The humans were running out of ammunition. I could hear the desperate clicks of empty weapons. They were going to be overrun. This was the end, the logical conclusion. Pure. I watched a human named Hayes, a boy who had been trembling in the corner just an hour before, drop his empty rifle. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't cower. He reached to his belt and pulled out a trench spade, a simple sharpened piece of flat metal on a wooden handle. He screamed. It wasn't a battle cry. Snorts. Greater than it was a guttural, primal noise that sounded like a wounded animal backed into a corner. Hayes charged. He ran directly into the plasma fire. A bolt grazed his shoulder, instantly cauterizing a deep groove of flesh, but he didn't stop. He slammed into the nearest coalition soldier, using his momentum to drive the heavy edge of the trench, spade into the narrow gap between the soldier's helmet and chest plate. Blood, bright, vibrant alien blood, sprayed across the gray tiles. The sight of it broke something in the room. The Snort humans didn't retreat. They surged forward. Men and women out of bullets drew combat knives, heavy wrenches, even jagged pieces of shattered concrete. They descended on the pristine white armor like a swarm of locusts. It was a massacre, but not the one I had calculated. I watched Carter tackle a coalition shock trooper. The trooper's plasma rifle discharged wildly, burning a hole through the ceiling. Carter lost his left eye to a glancing blow from the trooper's gauntlet. The side of his face a ruined mess of blood and burnt tissue. Carter didn't stop. He pinned the alien's arm down with his knee, pulled a serrated blade from his boot, and drove it repeatedly into the soft joints of the armor. Die. Carter spat, the word thick with blood. Die, die. The pristine white armor was soon coated in mud and gore. The perfect synchronized lines of the coalition vanguard dissolved into a chaotic, desperate brawl. And snorts in a brawl. Perfection is a liability. The humans didn't care about their own survival anymore. They fought with a suicidal ferocity that our soldiers simply could not process. A coalition trooper, trained in the finest academies of the hegemony, panicked. I saw it. He backed away, his rifle shaking, overwhelmed by a human with no legs who was crawling toward him with a primed explosive charge. The trooper turned to run. That was the moment the battle was decided. Fear is a contagion. Once the vanguard broke, the humans pushed them back into the tunnel, hacking and bludgeoning until the only sound left was the ragged breathing of the survivors and the drip of blood onto the flooded floor. I sat chained to my pipe, staring at the carnage. 30 coalition shock troops lay dead. Carter stood amidst the bodies. He tore a strip of fabric from a dead alien's undersuit and tied it clumsily around his ruined eye. He looked around the room. Half his people were dead. The other half were bleeding. He limped over to me. He stood over me panting, the knife still dripping in his hand. He looked down, his one good eye locking onto mine. Still believe in the math observer? He whispered. I couldn't speak. I looked at the trench spade embedded in the throat of our finest soldier. I looked at the humans bandaging each other in silence, picking up the weapons of their dead enemies. I realized then that we had made a terrible mistake. We had calculated their weapons. We had calculated their armor. We had calculated their numbers. But we forgot to calculate them. We did not bury our dead. The coalition considered corpses to be biological waste, efficiently incinerated by sanitation drones to prevent pathogen spread. The humans, I learned, viewed corpses as supply drops. In the hours following the tunnel breach, the triage center transformed into a makeshift armory. The stench of ozone and scorched meat lingered, but the humans worked through it with grim mechanical efficiency. They stripped the white ceramic composite plates from the fallen shock troops. They pried plasma rifles from stiffened three-fingered grips. They scavenged power cells, tearing them out of the armor's back plate housings with heavy wrenches and brute force. I no longer chained to the pipe. Carter had unclipped me, shoving a heavy canvas sack into my hands. You want to eat our rations. You carry the salvage. He had muttered, his voice muffled by the blood-soaked rag wrapped around his ruined eye. I complied. I was a prisoner, but I was also a pragmatist. My species did not possess a warrior ethos. If compliance ensured my continued observation and survival, I would comply. I watched a human named Sullivan, a short, broad-shouldered woman with grease deeply embedded in the lines of her face dismantle a coalition-heavy plasma repeater. She sat cross-legged in the dirt surrounded by a mess of wires and stripped power packs. She didn't have a diagnostic scanner. She didn't have a neural link schematic. She had a flathead screwdriver, a pair of wire cutters, and a stubborn scowl. "This safety interlock is a joke," Sullivan mumbled, tossing a small, intricate piece of coalition micro-engineering over her shoulder. It clattered against the damp tiles. "They route the thermal exhaust right past the primary capacitor." Snorts. Greater than, if I bypass the limiter and crosswire the trigger assembly." She stripped a copper wire with her teeth, spat out the plastic casing, and twisted it around a glowing blue power conduit. Sparks showered her lap. She didn't blink. "You will induce a catastrophic feedback loop," I warned her, stepping closer, genuinely concerned for the structural integrity of the cavern. "The weapon will detonate in your hands." Sullivan looked up at me. Her eyes were hard, the color of crushed slate. "Only if I hold the trigger for more than 3 seconds, Suit. Short, controlled bursts. It'll handle the heat. The risk of vaporization is 74%. Yeah, well, the risk of getting shot in the face if I don't have a gun is 100%. Sullivan replied. She slammed the casing back together and wrapped it tightly in black adhesive tape. She lifted the weapon. It was ugly now. The sleek aerodynamic lines of coalition design were ruined, replaced by a brutalist jury-rigged aesthetic. But when she squeezed the trigger, a beam of superheated plasma, twice as thick and violently unstable as its original output, scorched a hole through the concrete wall. Sullivan smiled. It was a terrifying expression. "Math, you bastard." That was the anatomy of human spite. They did not just want to survive. They wanted to take the tools of their oppressors, rake them, twist them, and use them to inflict maximum suffering. I sat near the perimeter later that cycle, chewing on a chalky, flavorless protein bar. Finch, the young medic, sat near me. Her hands were shaking. The adrenaline from the breach had faded, leaving behind the profound, crushing weight of exhaustion. Her medical smock was stiff with dried blood. Not all of it was human. "Why do you not flee into the deep caverns?" I asked her quietly. The question had been turning in my logic centers. The surface is lost. This level is compromised. Retreat is the only viable tactical option. Finch looked at her hands. She rubbed her thumb over a dark stain on her knuckles. "My brother is up there," she said. Her voice was thin, fragile, but it did not break. "He was at the garrison in Sector 4. I don't know if he's dead, but I know if I go deep, I stop looking. And if I stop looking, I leave him to your kind." Sector 4 was subjected to a continuous kinetic bombardment for 6 hours. I stated softly, trying to be factual rather than cruel. "The probability of survival—" "Shut up," she interrupted. She didn't yell. The whisper was worse. It held a cold edge that cut through my analytical detachment. "Just shut up. You don't get it. You fight for a flag, for an empire. We fight for the person standing next to us. You can bombard the dirt all you want, observer, but you can't glass a memory. You can't vaporize a promise." I looked at the humans resting in the dim light. They were broken, missing limbs, covered in burns, bleeding from a dozen minor shrapnel wounds. By every metric the coalition utilized, this force was combat and effective. They should have laid down their weapons and waited for the end. Instead, Carter stood up. He loaded a scavenged plasma cell into his kinetic rifle, having taped it to the underbarrel. "Listen up," Carter barked. The low murmur of the triage center died instantly. "They tried to crack our roof. That means they're setting up a forward operating base right above us. They think we're buried. They think we're suffocating in the dark." He racked the slide of his weapon. The metallic clack was loud, definitive. "Let's go show them what crawls out of the grave." We moved upward through the arteries of a dead city. The ascent was agonizing. The humans utilized forgotten maintenance shafts and crumbling service, ladders that groaned under the weight of their scavenged gear. I climbed with them, my breath hitching in my chest. The atmospheric scrubbers in my suit were failing, forcing me to breathe the raw air of harvest. It tasted of ash and copper. Carter took point. Sullivan trailed behind him, lugging the violently modified heavy plasma repeater. There were 40 humans in total, a ragged, desperate militia moving to assault a fortified coalition command structure. It was tactical suicide. We reached a heavy grating that opened into the sub-basement of a ruined commercial spire. Carter pushed the grating aside, slipping into the shadows. We followed. When we finally reached the surface, the sky was bleeding. The orbital bombardment had ignited the upper atmosphere, greater than snorts, greater than staining the clouds a deep bruised crimson. Ash fell like gray snow, coating the shattered concrete and twisted rebar of New Savannah. In the center of the devastated plaza, the coalition had established their FOB. It was an imposing structure of modular white alloy surrounded by humming energy, shields, and automated heavy plasma turrets. Tall communication spires pierced the ruined skyline, broadcasting our dominion to the stars. Dozens of shock troops patrolled the perimeter. Cargo transports descended from orbit, dropping heavy munitions and armored walkers to secure the sector. We were crouched in the skeletal remains of a parking garage 300 meters away. "Look at them," a human named Cross whispered. He was missing 3 fingers on his left hand, the stumps wrapped in dirty gauze, strutting around like they owned the place. Carter pulled a pair of cracked binoculars to his face. Automated turrets on the north and south flanks. Shield generator is central locked behind the heavy armor. They've got a supply depot near the landing pad. That's our target. We can't breach the main shield, Carter. Sullivan muttered, wiping sweat from her forehead. Even with this rigged repeater, I'll only dent it before they glass us. We don't need to breach the shield, Carter said. A grim smile tugged at the unscarred half of his face. We just need to make them turn it off. The plan they formulated was so primitive, so inherently chaotic that my tactical subroutines crashed trying to simulate it. There was no synchronized assault. There was no calculated flanking maneuver. There was only raw, unadulterated diversion. Cross and 3 others slipped away into the ruins, carrying bags heavy with unexploded ordnance they had dug out of the rubble. Dead plasma mortar and cracked kinetic shells. We waited. The ash fell. My dual hearts pounded against my ribs. I realized with a sickening jolt that I was afraid, not of the humans, but of the white armor in the plaza. If I was spotted alongside them, I would be classified as compromised, and executed on sight. I was a part of the mud now. 10 minutes later, the northern sector of the ruined city erupted. It wasn't a precision strike. It was a massive, dirty explosion that threw a column of black smoke and pulverized concrete hundreds of feet into the crimson sky. The ground shook violently. The coalition phobe reacted instantly. Sirens wailed. The automated turret swiveled northward. 2 squads of shock troops, moving with that terrifying synchronized perfection, broke off from the perimeter and advanced toward the smoke to eliminate the threat. "They're taking the bait," Carter hissed. "Wait for it." The humans held their breath. They were perfectly still, like predators waiting in the tall grass. Then a second explosion rocked the southern flank. Cross had rigged a chain reaction using the city's ruptured subterranean gas lines. A massive geyser of fire tore through the street, engulfing a hovering coalition transport. It fell from the sky, a flaming wreck of twisted metal, crashing violently into the outer perimeter of the Ephobyte. The shields flared brightly, absorbing the kinetic impact of the crash, but the strain was immense. "Sullivan now," Carter roared. Sullivan stepped out from the cover of the concrete pillar. She hoisted the heavy modified repeater to her shoulder, braced her feet in the ash, and pulled the trigger. The weapon shrieked. It wasn't the clean, high-pitched hum of coalition weaponry. It sounded like a dying animal. A thick, unstable beam of blinding blue plasma tore across the plaza. It hit the flickering energy shield directly in front of the supply depot. The modified beam didn't penetrate. It spread. The sheer, unregulated thermal output overloaded the localized shield emitters. The transparent blue barrier turned a violent violet, whined in a high-pitched frequency that rattled my teeth, and then shattered. "Move! Move! Move!" Carter bellowed. The humans surged forward from the parking garage. They didn't run in a straight line. They moved like water, erratic and fluid, darting from crater to crater. The remaining coalition troops opened fire. White-hot plasma cut through the ash, vaporizing concrete and flesh. I saw a human woman vaporized mid-stride, her kinetic rifle clattering uselessly to the ground. But the others didn't stop. They stepped over her ashes and kept running. They reached the supply depot. It was stacked high with volatile plasma cells and heavy munitions. A coalition shock trooper, massive in his heavy assault armor, stepped from the depot to intercept them. He raised a heavy cannon, sweeping the area. Hayes, the boy who had charged with the trench spade in the tunnels, didn't hesitate. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He was carrying a backpack strapped tight to his chest, glowing with the unstable blue light of 6 cracked coalition power cells rigged to a dead man's switch. For New Savannah. Hayes screamed. He tackled the shock trooper. The impact didn't move the heavily armored alien, but Hayes wrapped his arms around the trooper's midsection, burying his face into the chest plate. He let go of the switch. The detonation was blinding. The shock wave knocked me off my feet, throwing me backward into a rusted ground car. When my vision cleared, there was a crater where Hayes and the trooper had been, and the fire had spread to the supply depot. "Fall back," Carter yelled, grabbing Sullivan by the webbing of her vest and hauling her backward. We ran. We scrambled back into the dark maw of the maintenance shaft just as the supply depot cooked off. The resulting explosion turned the night into day. The earth groaned in agony. A shock wave of heat and pressure roared over our heads, incinerating the entire plaza and taking the coalition FOB with it. We descended back into the dark. We had lost 12 humans. But as I looked at Carter's face in the dim emergency lighting, I saw no despair. I saw a terrifying grim satisfaction. They had snorts bled the sky. War, the archives taught us, was won by breaking the enemy's infrastructure. You destroy their factories, their farms, their command nodes, and the population capitulates. The humans taught me that true war is won by breaking the enemy's mind. 2 weeks after the destruction of the surface FOB, the coalition changed their tactics. They stopped sending infantry into the ruins. They recognized that the close quarters, chaotic environment neutralized their technological advantage. Instead, they deployed the Goliath. It was an automated quadrupedal siege walker, standing 4 stories tall. It was encased in interlocking plates of ablative armor, armed with twin heavy plasma casters and a belly-mounted seismic resonator meant to crush subterranean bunkers. It was a walking extinction event. I sat in a new forward hideout, a collapsed cathedral, its stained glass windows long shattered, leaving jagged teeth of colored glass in the stone frames. Rain poured through the ruined roof, turning the dust into a thick gray paste. I was monitoring a stolen coalition comms pad. I had managed to crack the local encryption. I was listening to the enemy, my own people. Sector 9 is clear. A coalition commander's voice crackled through the static. Deploying the Goliath to coordinates Alpha 7. Flatten the grid. If they are in the mud, crush the mud. I looked up at Carter. He was sitting on a ruined pew, sharpening a combat knife against a whetstone. The rhythmic shk sound echoed in the hollow nave of the cathedral. "They are bringing a Goliath," I said. My voice was tight. "It is a Class 4 siege engine. Your small arms will not register on its sensors. Your modified plasma repeaters will dissipate against its ablative plating. It will walk over this building and reduce it to gravel." Carter didn't stop sharpening the knife. "How heavy is it?" The question confused me. "Pardon?" "The machine," Carter grunted, testing the edge of the blade with his thumb. "How heavy is it?" "Approximately 400 metric tons. It is designed to withstand orbital drop impacts. Its mass is its primary anchor for the seismic resonator." Carter smiled. 400 tons. Good. Let them bring it." The ground began to vibrate an hour later. It wasn't a continuous rumble. It was a rhythmic, terrifying thud, thud, thud. The puddle of gray water near my boots rippled with each impact. The Goliath breached the skyline, stepping over the skeletal remains of a tenement building. It was a monument to coalition superiority. Rain hissed and turned to steam as it hit the walker's heated plasma coils. Its central optical sensor, a massive red orb, swept the ruins, searching for thermal signatures. The humans were hidden. They had smeared themselves in the thick, cold mud of the ruins to mask their body heat. They waited in the shattered basements and behind collapsed walls. The Goliath stepped into the open thoroughfare leading to the cathedral. It was a wide, paved avenue that had survived the bombardments relatively intact. "Wait for it," Carter whispered into his comms. The machine took another step. Thud. The heavy, clawed foot drove deep into the pavement. cracking the ancient asphalt. "Now," Carter said softly, "he didn't detonate an explosive. He didn't order a barrage. He pressed a simple analog detonator that sent a signal down a spool of copper wire. A mile away, at the city's ruined reservoir dam, a series of shaped charges blew. I knew about the dam. The coalition had ignored it, deeming the stagnant water supply irrelevant to the pacification effort. The sound arrived before the water. It was a deep, guttural roar that vibrated in my chest cavity. Then I saw it. A wall of churning black water, carrying entire cars, slabs of concrete, and twisted steel beams surging down the sloping avenue directly toward the Goliath. The Walker sensors detected the anomaly. Its massive hydraulic legs shifted, attempting to brace against the incoming kinetic force. But you cannot brace against an ocean. The floodwater slammed into the Goliath. The 400-ton machine shuddered violently. The ablative armor, designed to deflect superheated plasma, was useless against the sheer, crushing mass of 1,000,000 gallons of water and debris. A concrete pillar, riding the crest of the wave, slammed into the Walker's front left knee joint. Metal shrieked, sparks showered over the churning black water. The Goliath's leg buckled. The machine tilted dangerously, its stabilization thrusters firing in a desperate attempt to maintain balance. The massive chassis groaned. "It's off balance." Carter yelled over the roar of the flood. "Hit the joints. Break its knees." The humans emerged from the mud like vengeful spirits. They didn't aim for the heavy armor. They aimed for the exposed hydraulic lines and articulating joints that were currently screaming under the stress of the Walker's shifted weight. Sullivan fired her modified repeater. The violently unstable plasma beam struck the damaged knee joint. The intense heat instantly boiled the hydraulic fluid inside. The joint ruptured in a violent explosion of steam and shrapnel. The Goliath fell. It crashed into the flooded avenue with an impact that shattered the remaining windows of the cathedral. A tidal wave of muddy water washed over us. The machine thrashed in the current, its heavy plasma casters firing blindly into the sky, vaporizing the rain. The humans descended upon it. They waded through the waist-deep rushing water, carrying thermal charges, scavenged plasma cutters, and heavy kinetic rifles. They climbed the ruined legs of the Walker. They wedged thermal charges into the exhaust ports. They cut through the sensor housings with frantic, brutal efficiency. I stood on the steps of the cathedral, watching an apex machine of the coalition empire being dismantled by hairless apes in the mud. I looked down at the comms pad in my hand. The encrypted channel was panicking. "Command, this is Vanguard Actual. The Goliath is down. Repeat. The Goliath is down in Sector 9. We need immediate air support." "Negative, Vanguard. Atmospheric storms are preventing gunship deployment. Retreat to the AFEB perimeter." "We can't retreat. They're in the water. They're crawling on the hull. Command, they are cutting through the cockpit glass. Oh gods, they have cutters. The transmission cut to static." I slowly lowered the comms pad. I looked at Carter. He was standing on the chest of the fallen Goliath, his kinetic rifle raised, rain washing the mud and blood from his scarred face. He let out a ragged, triumphant scream that echoed over the roaring water. I felt a cold dread settle in my primary digestive tract. The coalition didn't understand what they had awakened. We thought we were fighting a military. We were fighting a force of nature. And nature does not negotiate. It endures. It adapts. And eventually it buries you. The fall of the Goliath did not bring silence to harvest. It brought a terrifying, localized quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes a catastrophic pressure release. For 3 weeks, the Coalition Orbital Command halted all ground infantry deployments in Sector 9. They pulled back their surviving patrols, established Narna, a hard perimeter 50 miles outside the ruined city limits, and simply watched us from orbit. I sat in the damp undercroft of the cathedral, my analytical subroutines attempting to process the sudden shift in enemy doctrine. I had been fully integrated into the human camp, not out of trust, but out of utility. I was their radio operator. My neural implants could decrypt the low-frequency burst transmissions the Coalition used for logistical updates. I transcribed them onto torn strips of ration packaging with a scavenged graphite pencil. I handed my latest translation to Carter. He looked worse than ever. The makeshift eye patch was gone, replaced by a deep, jagged concavity of scarred tissue that Finch had somehow kept from going necrotic. He was painfully thin, his uniform hanging off him like a shroud. "They are restructuring their threat models," I told him, pointing to the messy graphite script. "Administrator Korvath has taken direct control of the planetary pacification. He is a logistician. He does not fight wars, he balances ledgers." Carter coughed. A wet, rattling sound. "What does the ledger say, Suit?" "It says you are an unacceptable deficit." To understand the Coalition's profound confusion, one had to look at the raw data I had compiled. I had kept a running log of human resistance metrics in my internal memory, comparing them against the hegemony's standard pacification models. The discrepancies were no longer statistical anomalies. They were biological impossibilities. Tactical metric Coalition projection. Human reality on harvest morale. Collapse. 4 standard cycles. Infinite. Spite-driven. Resource depletion. 12 standard cycles. Self-sustaining. Scavenging. Unit. Cohesion loss. At 30% casualty rate. Maintained at 85% casualty rate surrender. Probability 99.8% upon command. Loss 0.0%. Command decentralized to individual units. Corbett realizes that urban combat neutralizes our heavy assets. I explained, tracing the supply lines on Carter's crude map. The Goliath was a test. Its destruction proved that entering the ruins costs more than the territory is worth. Therefore they will not enter. They will erase. Sullivan walked over, wiping grease onto her already blackened trousers. She had spent the last week cannibalizing the downed Goliath sensor array to build a crude early warning radar. Erase how? More orbital bombardments? We're already living in the basement of hell. Let them drop their rocks. Not kinetic strikes, I said softly. I felt a strange cold sensation in my chest. It took me a moment to identify it as shame. Thermobaric ignition. The sun drop protocol. The room went still. Even Jefferson, the double amputee who spent his days methodically packing shrapnel into pipe bombs, stopped moving. "Explain," Carter ordered. "It is an atmospheric incineration tactic," I said, avoiding his singular, piercing gaze. "They will deploy 4 seismic anchor beacons at the cardinal points of the city. Once active, the beacons generate a localized magnetic containment field. Then, a heavy cruiser in low orbit fires a continuous, unshielded plasma beam into the center of the field. The containment grid traps the heat. The containment grid traps the heat. The temperature inside the city limits will rise to 4,000 within minutes. The air will ignite. The oxygen will be instantly consumed. Nothing biological will survive. The city will be reduced to a flat plane of black glass. Finch dropped a roll of bandages. It rolled across the sloped floor, coming to a rest against my boot. "When?" Carter asked. He didn't sound panicked. He sounded like a man asking for the weather forecast. "Tomorrow," I replied. "At local dawn." The transmissions indicate the beacon dropships are already fueling. I expected despair. I expected the humans to finally break. By all logical parameters, this was the unsolvable equation. You cannot shoot fire. You cannot stab a temperature. Instead, Carter looked at Sullivan. "Can your radar track the dropships?" "If they come in low to plant the beacons, yeah," Sullivan grunted, rubbing her jaw. "But they'll have escorts, heavy ones. We can't hit all 4 cardinal points, Carter. We barely have 40 people who can still walk." "We don't need to hit all 4, Carter said, dragging a filthy finger across the map. He said it's a containment field, a circuit. You break one beacon, the field fails. The plasma beam dissipates harmlessly into the upper atmosphere. We hit the northern anchor. We throw every single body, every single bullet, every ounce of explosives we have left at the northern drop zone." He looked around the room. These were shattered people, starving, bleeding, running on fumes and hate. "We don't survive tomorrow," Carter said aloud. His voice was steady, echoing snorts off the cracked stone of the cathedral. "But if we die, we make damn sure we break their shiny toy on the way out. We make them look at the ashes and realize they couldn't even burn us right." There was no cheering. There were no battle cries. There was only the synchronized sound of 40 weapons being racked, loaded, and checked. Dawn on harvest was usually obscured by the thick layer of ash that choked the upper stratosphere. But today the sky tore open. 4 massive coalition drop ships descended through the clouds, their repulsor engines screaming as they fought the planet's gravity. They were heavily armored bricks of white composite flanked by swarms of automated drone fighters. We were positioned in the ruins of a massive industrial rail yard on the northern edge of New Savannah. The rusting hulks of overturned cargo trains provided a maze of heavy cover. The northern dropship was heading straight for us. I crouched behind the rusted wheels of a locomotive, clutching a coalition kinetic pistol Carter had shoved into my hands. My hands were shaking. I was an observer. I was meant to watch. But as the dropship hovered, kicking up a hurricane of dust and debris, I realized I had chosen a side. I was no longer observing the equation. I was a variable within it. "Wait until the beacon drops." Carter roared over the deafening whine of the engines. "We have to let them unhook it. If we destroy the ship before it drops, they'll just bring another one." The dropship's bay doors ground open. A massive cylindrical spire of dark metal, the seismic anchor was lowered by heavy mag clamps. It hovered 10 meters above the ground, adjusting its trajectory. Dozens of coalition shock troops rappelled down from the ship's flanks, their pristine white armor gleaming maliciously in the dim light. They formed a tight defensive perimeter around the drop zone, their energy shields locking together to create a phalanx. Clank, the anchor hit the earth. The ground shuddered as its internal pile drivers activated, driving massive spikes deep into the bedrock. A pulsing red light illuminated the top of the spire. It was armed. Light them up. Carter screamed. The rail yard erupted. The humans unleashed everything they had hoarded for the past month. Jefferson had rigged the overturned train cars with directional mines. He detonated them simultaneously. A wave of shrapnel and fire washed over the coalition phalanx. The energy shields flared and whined, deflecting the brunt of the blast, but the sheer kinetic force knocked several shock troops off their feet. That was all the opening the humans needed. They charged out from the rusted trains. It was a slaughter. The automated drone fighters swarmed down from the sky, their light plasma repeaters tearing through the human ranks. I watched a man named Briggs, a former school teacher who had spent the last 3 weeks rationing out our meager water supply, get stitched across the chest by drone fire. He didn't even scream. He just folded backward into the dirt. Anti-air, Sullivan bellowed. She hauled her modified heavy repeater onto the roof of a train car. She didn't aim at the troops. She aimed at the sky. She held the trigger down. The unstable blue beam lashed out like a whip, slicing through the air. It caught 3 drones in a single sweep, their chassis instantly melting into slag. But the weapon was overheating. The blue coils on the barrel turned white hot. "Sullivan, it's critical." I screamed from my cover, my optical sensors flashing warning runes at the thermal output. She didn't stop. "Keep moving, Carter." She yelled, her face illuminated by the blinding light of the failing weapon. The repeater detonated. The explosion took the roof off the train car and vaporized Sullivan instantly. There was no body left to recover, just a scorch mark on the rusted metal. But her sacrifice had cleared the sky long enough for the human infantry to reach the phalanx. The battle devolved into the horrific, close-quarters brutality I had witnessed in the tunnels, but amplified by the desperation of absolute finality. Carter was a demon in the ash. He fired his kinetic rifle until the barrel warped, then used it as a club, smashing the buttstock into the visor of a coalition soldier. Finch, the medic, was not healing today. She had a scavenged plasma cutter. She slid under the locked shields of the vanguard, driving the searing beam upward through the unarmored joints of a soldier's thigh plating. Blood and steam hissed into the air, but they were dying. For every coalition soldier that fell, 2 humans were cut down. The math was finally reasserting itself. The numbers were too vast. The technology gap was too wide. Carter pushed through the chaotic melee, his eyes fixed entirely on the pulsing red beacon of the seismic anchor. He had a satchel charge slung over his shoulder. 50 pounds of raw mining explosive packed with ball bearings. A coalition heavy gunner stepped into his path, raising a rotary plasma cannon. Cross intercepted. The man with the missing fingers threw himself at the gunner, driving a combat knife into the alien's shoulder. The gunner roared, swatting Cross aside with a backhand that shattered the human's ribs with a sickening crunch. The cannon fired a wild burst of plasma that grazed Carter's side. Carter stumbled, dropping to one knee. The flesh on his left flank was instantly carbonized. He dropped his ruined rifle, gasping for air, the satchel charge slipping from his shoulder. The heavy gunner aimed the cannon directly at Carter's head. I didn't calculate. I didn't process the risk metrics. I didn't run a survival probability simulation. I stepped out from behind the train wheel, raised the heavy kinetic pistol, and pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly dislocated my wrist. The heavy slug struck the gunner in the side of the helmet. It didn't penetrate the armor, but the kinetic transfer snapped the alien's head violently to the side, throwing his aim off. The plasma burst scorched the earth a foot away from Carter. Carter looked back at me. He didn't say thank you. He just grabbed the satchel charge, forced himself to his feet, and sprinted the final 20 yards to the beacon. He didn't try to plant it and run. He knew he didn't have the time. He knew he didn't have the legs. Carter slammed his back against the dark metal of the seismic anchor. He wrapped his arms around the satchel charge, holding it tight against the spire's central control housing. He looked out at the rail yard, at the burning trains, at the bodies of his people in the mud. He found the detonator switch. The explosion was a concussive wave of pure silence, followed by a roar that ruptured my eardrums. I was thrown backward into the dirt, the air forced from my lungs. A rain of twisted metal and pulverized rock showered over the rail yard. When I managed to sit up, my vision swimming with static, the beacon was gone. The heavy composite spire had been snapped in half, its internal circuitry exposed and burning with a violent electrical fire. Carter was gone, too. The remaining coalition troops stopped fighting. They stood in the ash, staring at the destroyed anchor. The pulsing red light was dead. The containment field could not form. The sun-drop protocol was broken. High above in the stratosphere, the clouds parted. A beam of superheated plasma, thick as a skyscraper, descended from the heavens. But there was no magnetic field to catch it. The beam struck the empty wasteland miles outside the city, carving a useless glowing scar into the uninhabited bedrock before the orbital cruiser realized the circuit was dead and cut the power. The math had failed. The machine was broken. The humans did not cheer. In the archived holovids the Coalition used for mandatory military conditioning, victories were always punctuated by synchronized roars of triumph and the raising of polished banners. Here, in the shattered smoking crater of the northern rail yard, there was only the ragged wheezing sound of lungs fighting for air through a curtain of pulverized concrete. I lay in the dirt for a long time. My auditory receptors were blown, feeding my neural implant. Nothing but a high-pitched digital whine. Nothing but a high-pitched digital whine. When the calibrators finally reset, the silence of harvest rushed in. It was absolute. The deafening roar of the heavy plasma casters was gone. The rhythmic, earth-shattering thud of the orbital bombardment had ceased. There were only 11 humans left, standing amidst the burning wreckage of the trains. 11, out of the 40 who had marched from the cathedral. The surviving coalition shock troops, perhaps 20 of them. The hardened remnants of a vanguard that had conquered entire hemispheres on other worlds, did something I had never seen in the 6,000-year recorded history of our empire. They lowered their weapons. They did not check their energy reserves. They did not reestablish a tactical grid. They simply looked at the humans. They looked at Finch, who was kneeling in the mud beside Cross, her bloody hands resting uselessly on a ruined chest that no longer rose and fell. They looked at Jefferson, the double amputee, who had dragged himself to the edge of the crater where Carter had detonated the charge. The earth there was fused into rough glass from the heat. Jefferson just sat there, his dirty hands resting on the still, warm ground, staring down into the dark pit as if waiting for Carter to climb back out and yell at them to keep moving. The white armor of the coalition soldiers was scorched black, cracked, greater than snorts, greater than, and weeping vibrant alien blood. They were machines of flesh, programmed for perfection, and they had been broken by people who had nothing left to lose. The shock troops took a collective step backward, then another. They activated their encrypted recall beacons. Within minutes, the screaming whine of repulsor engines cut through the falling ash as 3 extraction shuttles dropped from the bleeding sky. The soldiers boarded in silence. They didn't secure the perimeter. They didn't attempt to recover the ruined multi-billion credit seismic anchor. They just piled into the sterile bays of their ships and fled. I sat up, my joints screaming, my suit servos whining in protest. My translation implant crackled. It picked up a wide-band, unencrypted broadcast, cascading down from the dreadnought Righteous Axiom in high orbit. It was Administrator Corvus. His voice lacked the crisp, arrogant cadence of a coalition logistician. It sounded thin, hollow. All ground units, this is Command Actual. Cease pacification operations. Recall all assets to the primary fleet. The resource expenditure on harvest has exceeded acceptable operational parameters by 412%. The structural integrity of our surface logic is compromised. We are cutting our losses. This system is hereby quarantined. Let them have the dirt. They were retreating. The great coalition empire, the mathematical certainty of the cosmos, was abandoning a planet to a species that hadn't even mastered faster than light travel. They couldn't afford the blood. More importantly, they couldn't afford the psychological contagion of fighting an enemy that used its own corpses as stepping stones. I forced myself to my feet. My boots felt like lead. I walked over to the 11 survivors. They were moving through the wreckage, their faces blank, their movements automated by shock and adrenaline withdrawal. They were cutting the dog tags off the fallen. A small metallic clink sounded every time Finch dropped a blood-stained aluminum rectangle into her heavy canvas pouch. She stopped in front of me. Her medical smock was unrecognizable, stiff with the dried blood of friends and enemies alike. Her eyes were sunken, hollowed out by grief and exhaustion, but they held a terrifying diamond-hard clarity. She wasn't looking at an observer anymore. She was looking at a witness. "Are they gone?" she asked. Her voice cracked, dry as the ash falling around us. "They are returning to orbit," I confirmed. I kept my tone flat, completely stripped of the usual coalition superiority. "The blockade will likely remain to prevent your expansion, but the ground invasion is over. Administrator Corvath has classified your species as unpacifiable." Finch nodded slowly. She wiped a streak of blood from her cheek, smearing it deep into the soot on her skin. "Good. Let them sit up there in the dark. Let them freeze in their perfect little ships and think about what happened down here in the mud." I looked up. Through the jagged rent in the clouds left by the dropships, I could see the massive silhouettes of the coalition cruisers breaking orbit. Their main thrusters ignited, burning bright blue as they pushed away from the gravity well of harvest. Just yesterday they looked like angry gods hovering over a terrified world. Now they just looked like machines. Machines built by a species that had forgotten what it meant to bleed. We thought war was a math equation. We believed that superior technology, synchronized tactics, and overwhelming numbers were the only variables that mattered in the cold vacuum of space. We cataloged the universe into neat, logical columns of debits and credits, acquisitions and liquidations. If X is greater than Y, Y must fall. But humanity is not a number. Humanity is a biological paradox. They are fragile, deeply flawed, and inherently chaotic. They panic in the dark. They make gross tactical errors. Their biology is laughably vulnerable to extreme heat, cold, and kinetic trauma. Yet beneath that fragile skin lies a terrifying engine of spite and love. They do not fight for logic. They do not fight for a flag or an empire or an administrator's ledger. They fight for the person standing to their left. They fight for the memory of the dead. They fight simply to spite the universe for daring to try and kill them. You cannot calculate spite. You cannot predict the explosive yield of a broken heart. When you take away everything a human has, they do not default to zero. They default to vengeance. I reached up to my chest plate. My fingers gripped the polished silver, insignia of the Coalition Observer Corps, the geometric crest of a perfect ordered empire. I ripped it off. The retaining pin snapped with a sharp click. I let the heavy piece of metal fall into the mud. It sank immediately, disappearing beneath the gray water and the ash. I am an observer no longer. I am a witness. I watched humans fight. I watched them bleed, burn, and tear an empire apart with their bare hands, shattered trench spades, and broken teeth. As I stood in the ruins of New Savannah, watching the surviving humans pass around a single dented aluminum canteen of water, I finally understood the fundamental truth of the galaxy. It wasn't that our armor was too thin or our plasma not hot enough. We never stood a chance because of a simple, undeniable fact. When you back a human into a corner, they don't surrender. They just change the rules of the game. If you want to hear more stories about humanity doing the impossible and making the galaxy tremble, smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Did Carter and Sullivan's sacrifices hit you hard? Drop a comment below and let me know your favorite moment from the Siege of Harvest. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans to help the channel grow. Stay tuned because humanity is just getting started. Humanity is just getting started.